Darnell Foster's art was not just a reflection of his talent, it was an outpouring of his life's journey. As a young black artist, Darnell had always felt the weight of history, identity, and race pressing against him. His work, deeply rooted in his personal experiences and the experiences of his community, was raw and emotional. Every canvas was a piece of his soul, a confrontation with the world around him, challenging what people thought they knew about race, identity, and power. But the art world wasn't ready for him. He spent years struggling to break through, pouring everything he had into his work, but it seemed as though the door to recognition remained firmly closed. He worked from a small, modest studio that barely fit the supplies he needed. His canvases, unfinished work stacked against the wall, felt like a constant reminder of how far away his dreams were. Despite this, he was unwavering in his dedication to his craft, constantly striving to create art that spoke to his truths. He knew he had something worth sharing, even if the world wasn't ready to listen. Darnell's upbringing in a working-class neighborhood shaped his art. Growing up in a family that worked tirelessly just to survive, art was his escape. His mother, a schoolteacher, had always encouraged him to use his creative talents, but the challenges of daily life made it clear that creativity alone wouldn't pay the bills. Still, art provided Darnell with something no other aspect of life could: expression. It was the one place where he could be himself without judgment, and through art, he processed the world, its injustices, and his place in it. His paintings were both his therapy and his protest, a way to deal with the daily reality of being black in America and, in many ways, his resistance to the systems that kept him invisible. But despite his dedication, his journey through the art world was marked by rejection. Every gallery he approached, every collector he contacted, seemed to turn him away. His work wasn't polished enough, they would say, or they simply couldn't see its value. The systemic barriers in the art world, the focus on prestige, connections, and wealth, were insurmountable for someone like Darnell. It was a bitter reality that, no matter how much talent he had, the world was unwilling to make space for him. Jonathan Caldwell was the very embodiment of the elite art world. As the owner of the prestigious Caldwell Gallery, he had spent years cultivating a reputation for showcasing only the finest works from renowned artists. The walls of his gallery were adorned with pieces that spoke to status, wealth, and sophistication. Jonathan was a gatekeeper, controlling what was considered worthy of the art world's attention. To Jonathan, art was not merely an expression of the artist, it was a reflection of culture, status, and taste. He held a narrow, almost elitist view of what art should be, and he was quick to dismiss anything that didn't conform to his vision. His gallery was reserved for those artists who had been deemed serious enough by the established art world, those with proper credentials, prestigious exhibitions, and connections to high society. It was a space where art wasn't just about creativity, it was about prestige and influence. Jonathan's view of the art world was, in many ways, a reflection of his own life. Raised in privilege, he saw art as something that belonged to the elite, something to be purchased, displayed, and admired, rather than something to be felt or experienced. His bias against unconventional or less refined art was well known. He saw works that were deeply personal, raw, or provocative as unfit for his gallery, especially if they came from artists who did not fit into his definition of what was worthy. For Jonathan, the world of art was a space for the refined and the privileged, not the marginalized or the unpolished. His dismissive attitude toward artists from diverse or underrepresented backgrounds was nothing new. Jonathan's gallery perpetuated a cycle where only a select few could succeed, and those who didn't fit the mold were overlooked. It was a system he had helped build, a system that excluded voices like Darnell's and relegated them to the margins. The first encounter, Darnell approaches the gallery. Despite the odds stacked against him, Darnell remained hopeful. He had heard of Caldwell Gallery, and he had been struck by the idea of his work hanging on those pristine walls. He knew that Jonathan Caldwell was one of the most influential figures in the art world, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that this could be the opportunity that would change everything. With a sense of quiet hope, Darnell gathered his best work, his most powerful pieces that spoke to the heart of his struggles and dreams, and prepared to present them to Jonathan. He walked through the grand doors of Caldwell Gallery, his heart racing as he stepped into a world that felt foreign, even hostile. The walls were adorned with glossy, sophisticated works from established artists, pieces that seemed so far removed from Darnell's own raw, untamed style. But Darnell pushed his nerves aside. This was his chance. He approached the receptionist, and soon, Jonathan Caldwell himself appeared, his sharp eyes scanning Darnell as if he were a specimen to be evaluated rather than an artist to be respected. Jonathan listened as Darnell spoke passionately about his work, about the themes of identity, race, and personal struggle that shaped each piece. But as Darnell handed him his portfolio, Jonathan's gaze became critical, dismissive. He flipped through the pages quickly, barely pausing to consider the intricacies of Darnell's work. "This is interesting," Jonathan said, his voice thick with condescension. "But it's raw. Too raw. It's not refined enough for a gallery of this caliber. I'm afraid we're not looking for this kind of expression." The word stung. Darnell stood there, feeling the weight of rejection pressing against him. Jonathan's critique was not just about his work, it was a judgment on his very existence as an artist, one that disregarded the deep cultural and personal meanings behind each stroke of paint. With a polite nod, Darnell thanked Jonathan for his time, his face flushed with humiliation. As he left the gallery, a flood of emotion surged within him, anger, frustration, but also something deeper. He vowed silently to himself that he would prove Jonathan and others like him wrong. This rejection, painful as it was, would not define him. It would be the fuel for the fire that drove him to succeed on his own terms. As he walked away from the gallery, Darnell knew that his journey would not be an easy one. But he was no longer just seeking validation from the elite art world. His vision was bigger than that. And one day, Jonathan would see the true value of his art. While Jonathan Caldwell remained focused on the traditional, elite art scene that he had helped create, Darnell Foster's art was finding a new home in more progressive, underground circles. As the art world continued to cling to its outdated standards, Darnell's work began to resonate with a growing group of collectors and art enthusiasts who were hungry for something new, something that spoke to the lived experiences of those who had been left out of the mainstream conversation. Darnell's paintings, with their deep explorations of race, identity, and the struggles of the Black community, connected with those who valued powerful narratives over conventional aesthetics. His art was more than just decoration, it was a conversation, a voice that spoke of resilience, pain, and beauty, all wrapped up in vibrant colors and bold strokes. The themes he explored in his work, particularly the complexity of African heritage and the ongoing battle for equality, resonated with people who understood the power of these stories. These collectors, many of whom had their own ties to marginalized communities, could see the depth of Darnell's vision. His pieces spoke to them on a personal level, sparking a sense of shared identity and purpose. Though Darnell's rise to recognition was not immediate, he quickly gained a following. His work was not in high demand in the traditional galleries or auction houses, but in the underground, it was cherished. Independent curators and small, progressive galleries took notice of his work and began featuring his pieces in exhibitions. This wasn't the mainstream art world, this was a subculture where authenticity mattered more than status, and where collectors sought out new, bold voices. Word of Darnell's work spread, and while it wasn't yet in the global spotlight, it was slowly becoming a force within these alternative spaces. Darnell's loyal following of collectors, those who had supported him from the beginning, continued to grow, and with it, his reputation as an artist to watch. His art was not just valued for its cultural significance, but for its emotional power. The people who bought his pieces weren't just acquiring art for their walls, they were acquiring something that told a story, something that spoke to the ongoing fight for social change. In these circles, Darnell was being recognized not only for his talent but for his ability to bring a new perspective into the world of contemporary art. Breakthrough moment, Darnell's auction success. The tipping point for Darnell's career came when one of his most significant works, The Unseen Story, was bought by a prestigious auction house in New York. This piece, an evocative exploration of African heritage and the legacy of resistance, was a masterpiece that captured the essence of Darnell's vision. It depicted the complexities of history, the unseen struggles, and the resilience of a community that had long been ignored by the mainstream art world. The painting was bold, abstract, and deeply personal. Every stroke of paint was infused with emotion and meaning. At the auction, the unseen story stunned everyone. Bidding for the piece escalated beyond expectations, and when the hammer finally came down, the price was astronomical, far beyond what anyone had predicted for a relatively unknown artist. The sale was a game-changer, sending ripples through the art world. Major collectors, critics, and galleries began to take notice of Darnell's talent. His name was now being mentioned alongside emerging stars in the art world, and his work was viewed as a fresh, innovative voice in contemporary art. This breakthrough moment thrust Darnell into the spotlight. His work was suddenly in high demand, with galleries reaching out to him for exhibitions and collectors eager to add his pieces to their collections. The sale of the unseen story was a clear signal that Darnell was no longer just a niche artist, he was a major force in the art world, and his unique perspective was something that couldn't be ignored. Despite the growing attention and newfound success, Darnell stayed true to his roots. He continued to focus on his craft, creating pieces that challenged the status quo and reflected his personal experiences. The success of the unseen story didn't change his commitment to authenticity, it only reinforced the idea that his voice, his perspective, and his work were important. He knew that his rise wasn't just about financial gain or fame, it was about continuing to use his art as a tool for change. Gallery owners continued dismissal. Back at Caldwell Gallery, Jonathan Caldwell was still completely unaware of Darnell's breakthrough. The art world Jonathan knew, with its reliance on connections and prestigious networks, remained steadfast in its traditional view of what constituted valuable art. Jonathan continued to focus on the artists who fit his mold, those who were refined, polished, and deemed worthy by the established standards of the art world. Darnell, in Jonathan's eyes, was still just a fad, a passing trend that would eventually fizzle out. Despite Darnell's growing success, Jonathan dismissed the artist's work with the same disdain he had expressed when they first met. He continued to mock Darnell's success, laughing at the idea that a raw artist like him could ever make a real impact. To Jonathan, the unseen story was nothing more than a hype piece bought up by trendy collectors who didn't know any better. He laughed at the notion that an artist like Darnell could ever become a lasting force in the art world. But Jonathan's ignorance was his undoing. As Darnell's works continued to gain attention, Jonathan's gallery began to suffer. His refusal to adapt to the changing art world and his narrow focus on traditional aesthetics left him behind. Younger, more dynamic artists like Darnell were taking center stage, and the traditional patrons of Caldwell Gallery began to look elsewhere for new work. The gallery's exhibitions were no longer generating the buzz they once had, and Jonathan found himself losing touch with the new direction that the art world was taking. One afternoon, as Jonathan was speaking with a fellow gallery owner, he couldn't help but overhear a conversation about Darnell's recent success. "Have you seen the auction results for the unseen story? That piece sold for millions," the other gallery owner remarked. "People are saying Darnell Foster is the next big thing." Jonathan froze. For a brief moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The very artist he had mocked was now a major player in the art world, and Jonathan had missed his chance. He could feel the pang of regret, but he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he tried to brush it off, claiming, "It's just a passing trend. I'm not worried about it." But deep down, Jonathan knew the truth, he had misjudged Darnell, and now the world was catching up. As galleries scrambled to secure Darnell's work and collectors lined up to purchase his pieces, Jonathan found himself struggling to keep pace with the changing art world. The realization stung, he had lost control of the very artist he had dismissed. For Darnell, this continued dismissal only fueled his determination. He was no longer seeking validation from the likes of Jonathan Caldwell. His success was not dependent on the approval of the old guard, it was a testament to the power of authenticity, resilience, and the ability to challenge the status quo. Darnell Foster's rise in the art world was nothing short of meteoric. What started as a quiet, underground following quickly exploded into global recognition. With each piece Darnell created, his art continued to increase in value, both financially and culturally. His paintings, deeply rooted in themes of race, identity, and historical struggle, struck a chord with a broad audience. The depth of his work, its emotional resonance, and its layered commentary on Black history and identity made it more than just visually stunning. It was art that made people think, reflect, and confront uncomfortable truths. Major galleries and museums around the world began to take notice of Darnell. He was invited to exhibit his work in prestigious spaces in Paris, London, New York, and beyond. His pieces were now displayed alongside the works of other cultural icons, and the buzz around his name continued to grow. Auction houses began to feature Darnell's work, with pieces consistently selling for millions, an amount that stunned even the most seasoned art collectors. Where his work had once been relegated to the margins, it was now commanding the highest prices on the market. Critics hailed Darnell for his ability to blend contemporary techniques with profound cultural narratives. They described his work as a transformative force in the art world, blending abstract expressionism with potent storytelling. His paintings were seen as more than just art, they were social commentary, powerful visualizations of the human experience, and explorations of the ongoing struggles of Black identity. Darnell's ability to convey the complexities of race and history through his work was unparalleled, and it quickly became clear that he was a cultural innovator, pushing the boundaries of what art could be. As Darnell's profile skyrocketed, his name became synonymous with change in the art world. He was no longer just an emerging artist, he was one of the most sought-after figures in contemporary art. Global collectors who had once overlooked his work now clamored to acquire his pieces, and prestigious art institutions vied for the opportunity to showcase his art. Media outlets, from magazines to television shows, began to feature Darnell's story, cementing his status as a trailblazer in the industry. The art world was no longer the exclusive domain of the old guard, it was changing, and Darnell was at the forefront of that transformation. Jonathan Caldwell's realization. Meanwhile, back at Caldwell Gallery, Jonathan Caldwell was beginning to feel the weight of his earlier dismissal of Darnell. While the art world moved forward, Jonathan remained stuck in his traditional, narrow view of what art could and should be. He began to hear whispers about Darnell's success, whispers that turned into loud discussions as his paintings continued to fetch astronomical prices at auction. Jonathan watched in disbelief as Darnell's name was mentioned alongside some of the greatest living artists, and galleries across the world signed exclusive deals to feature his work. Jonathan had always prided himself on being a gatekeeper of the art world, and he had made his fortune by showcasing the most refined, sophisticated works. He had rejected Darnell's raw, emotionally charged pieces without truly understanding the significance of what he had seen. Now, he was watching in frustration as other galleries reaped the benefits of Darnell's rise to fame. Jonathan's gallery, once at the pinnacle of success, began to struggle. Younger artists who shared Darnell's bold vision were now dominating the art scene, and Caldwell Gallery's carefully curated space no longer felt fresh or relevant. As Jonathan scrolled through articles online or flipped through art magazines, he couldn't escape the growing buzz around Darnell. The artist had become the face of a new era in contemporary art, one that was defined by authenticity, cultural relevance, and social change. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. He had watched the rise of Darnell from a distance, convinced that it was just a fleeting moment in the ever-changing art world. But now, the success was undeniable. Darnell had outpaced him in ways Jonathan couldn't have imagined, and he was left scrambling to keep up. Panic began to set in. Jonathan feared he had missed out on the opportunity of a lifetime. He had passed on the chance to represent Darnell when the artist was still relatively unknown, and now, as Darnell's success grew, Jonathan saw the art world slipping further away from him. Darnell's rise was far more than a passing trend, it was a transformation, and Jonathan had failed to recognize it. As he watched the prices of Darnell's work soar, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder, would he ever have a chance to work with Darnell again, or had that ship already sailed? Darnell's new identity. With his newfound fame, Darnell's identity as an artist was no longer just about creating art, it was about taking control of his career and reshaping the art world. Darnell had learned the hard way that the traditional structures of the art industry didn't always have his best interests at heart. He had built his success without relying on the established power players of the art world, and now, he was determined to continue that path. Darnell began negotiating directly with galleries, bypassing the gatekeepers like Jonathan Caldwell. He no longer needed someone else to define his worth, he could now define it for himself. His financial success allowed him to take full control of his exhibitions, ensuring that his work was showcased on his own terms. Rather than relying on traditional galleries to dictate his career, Darnell built his own network, creating opportunities for himself and for other artists like him who had been excluded from the mainstream art world. But Darnell's rise was not solely about financial success. It was about something far greater, changing the art world's values and providing opportunities for others. With his platform, Darnell established mentorship programs for young artists, particularly those from marginalized communities, to help them navigate the art world and find success on their own terms. He wanted to ensure that other artists wouldn't have to face the same struggles he had, struggles of rejection, systemic racism, and being pushed aside because their work didn't conform to traditional expectations. Darnell's influence began to spread beyond the art world. He used his visibility to elevate voices that had been silenced for too long, ensuring that the new wave of artists was inclusive, diverse, and reflective of the world's true experiences. He pushed for exhibitions that showcased work from artists of all backgrounds, artists who were traditionally overlooked and ignored. Darnell knew that his success wasn't just about himself, it was about changing the industry, reshaping the conversation, and showing that anyone, regardless of their background or identity, could succeed if given the chance. In doing so, Darnell Foster transformed from a struggling artist into a symbol of resilience, innovation, and empowerment in the art world. He became a living proof that the status quo could be challenged, and that the future of art was in the hands of those who were brave enough to speak their truth and unapologetically share their vision. Darnell Foster had spent years navigating the art world on his own terms, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers and carving out his own path. By now, he had not only established himself as one of the most sought-after artists in the world, but he had also built a fortune and an influential network of collectors, investors, and art enthusiasts. Yet despite his success, Darnell knew there was one final step to complete his vision, taking control of Caldwell Gallery. Jonathan Caldwell's gallery had been a thorn in his side, a symbol of the elitist art world that had rejected him and countless others like him. Now, with his influence and financial resources, Darnell saw an opportunity to reshape the gallery into a platform for emerging voices, particularly those from marginalized communities. He didn't just want to beat Jonathan at his own game, he wanted to change the game entirely. Darnell began quietly purchasing shares in Caldwell Gallery, leveraging his connections with investors and wealthy art collectors who believed in his vision. His strategy was subtle at first, slowly acquiring enough stock to become a significant stakeholder in the gallery. As Darnell's influence grew, so did his control over the gallery's operations. He began restructuring the gallery's approach to art, pushing it towards inclusivity, diversity, and cultural relevance. He introduced new policies that favored emerging artists from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the gallery would reflect the changing landscape of the art world. At the same time, Caldwell Gallery's financial struggles deepened. The traditional art world, which Jonathan had long relied on, was losing relevance. More and more artists like Darnell, whose work addressed social issues and had deep cultural resonance, were gaining traction. Jonathan's refusal to adapt to this shift had left his gallery vulnerable, and Darnell's growing stake in the gallery gave him the power to steer it in a completely new direction. As Darnell's control over Caldwell Gallery became more apparent, he realized that the time was fast approaching when he could take over completely. Jonathan, whose stubbornness and outdated views had led to the gallery's decline, was unaware of the changes happening behind the scenes. Darnell, meanwhile, was perfectly positioned to not only take control of the gallery but to reshape it into a space that would reflect his values and vision for the art world. Jonathan Caldwell's downfall. Jonathan Caldwell's downfall was slow but inevitable. The art world was changing, and his inability to adapt to the rise of new voices and diverse perspectives left his gallery struggling to stay relevant. The increasing demand for contemporary, socially conscious art was a shift that Jonathan had refused to acknowledge. His insistence on showcasing traditional, often elitist art was no longer enough to attract the collectors and art enthusiasts of today. Meanwhile, Darnell's success was in full swing. His exhibitions were now showcased in major museums, his works were fetching millions at auction, and his reputation as a tastemaker grew exponentially. The new generation of art collectors, who valued innovation and cultural relevance, flocked to Darnell's work. As Darnell continued to thrive, Jonathan watched helplessly as his once thriving business slipped further from his grasp. The art world that Jonathan had known and dominated for years was slipping away, and he was unable to keep up with the changes. He continued to rely on his old methods, showcasing the same types of art that had once brought him success, but now they felt stale and out of touch. Galleries representing diverse voices, like Darnell's, were gaining more and more traction, and Jonathan's gallery became an afterthought in the eyes of many art enthusiasts. As the competition grew fiercer, Jonathan became desperate. Jonathan was shocked when Darnell called him into the gallery's main office. He had sensed the changes in the air, but he hadn't realized how serious Darnell's intentions were. When Darnell sat down across from him, the gravity of the situation became clear. "I know this must be a surprise, Jonathan," Darnell began, his voice calm and unwavering. "But I want you to know that I've been quietly purchasing shares in the gallery for the past few years. I now control Caldwell Gallery." Jonathan's face turned pale. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. "This is my gallery. I built it. You can't just come in and take over." Darnell leaned forward, locking eyes with Jonathan. "This gallery is no longer what it used to be, Jonathan. The world is changing, and you refused to see it. You rejected me when I was just trying to get a chance. But now, I'm in charge. And this gallery will be reshaped to reflect the voices that have been ignored for too long." Jonathan's pride and arrogance had always been his driving force, but now, they were his undoing. He realized too late that the art world had evolved beyond his control, and his stubbornness had left him in a losing position. "You can't just," Jonathan started, but Darnell interrupted him. "I'm not here to seek revenge, Jonathan," Darnell said, his voice steady but firm. "My success was never about proving you wrong. It was about creating something bigger than both of us. I'm changing the art world, and this gallery will be a place for emerging artists, for voices that matter. You'll have a position here, but you won't be in charge anymore." Jonathan, humbled by the turn of events, finally spoke the words Darnell had waited to hear. "I regret how I treated you. I was wrong. You've done something incredible, Darnell. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. I'm sorry for underestimating you." Darnell nodded, but his expression was unchanged. "I didn't need your apology, Jonathan. My success wasn't about seeking validation from you, it was about creating my own path. And now, I'm giving others the same opportunity." Darnell stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. He had achieved what he set out to do: take control of the gallery, reshape the art world, and provide a platform for artists who had been excluded for far too long. Jonathan Caldwell's legacy, once so tightly tied to this gallery, was now overshadowed by Darnell's vision for a new era in the art world. Under Darnell Foster's leadership, Caldwell Gallery was transformed into a dynamic and influential institution in the art world. Once known for its exclusivity and focus on elite art, the gallery was now a vibrant hub for emerging artists from diverse backgrounds. Darnell's vision was clear: art was not just for the wealthy or the privileged, it was for everyone. The gallery became a place where new, powerful voices could be heard. Where artists whose work reflected the realities of life, especially for marginalized communities, could thrive. The walls of the gallery, once adorned with only the works of established artists, were now filled with vibrant, challenging pieces that spoke to the human experience. From social justice to identity, to the complexities of race, Caldwell Gallery's exhibitions became an important space for cultural dialogue. Artists were invited to showcase work that defied the norms, broke down boundaries, and opened up new conversations about what art could, and should, be. The gallery no longer served as a place for art collectors to flaunt their wealth, it became a space for creative freedom and expression. Art was now seen as a tool for change, a way to challenge the status quo, and a vehicle for sparking meaningful dialogue. Darnell also established mentorship programs for young artists, particularly those from underrepresented communities. Through these initiatives, he gave emerging talent the tools, resources, and opportunities that he had been denied early in his career. His goal was to ensure that no artist had to face the same barriers he had experienced. Artists would no longer have to fight for recognition or navigate the art world's systemic obstacles on their own. By providing financial support, guidance, and exhibition opportunities, Darnell paved the way for a new generation of creators who would carry forward his vision of a more inclusive, diverse, and impactful art world. Caldwell Gallery, under Darnell's leadership, became an influential force not just in the art world, but in the cultural landscape at large. It was a beacon for those who believed in the power of art to make a difference, to change minds, and to drive social progress. The gallery's new identity reflected Darnell's own evolution, from a rejected artist to a leader who reshaped the very institution that had once dismissed him. Reflection on the journey. As Darnell stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by works from the next generation of artists, he took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. His journey from struggling artist to gallery owner had been anything but easy. He had faced rejection, financial hardship, and systemic barriers in an art world that wasn't prepared to accept someone like him. But through it all, Darnell had remained dedicated to his craft, determined to tell his story and the stories of others who had been silenced for far too long. He thought back to the day Jonathan Caldwell had rejected him, the day he had walked out of the gallery feeling humiliated but also more determined than ever to succeed on his own terms. That rejection had been the catalyst for everything that came after. Darnell had never sought revenge. He had never set out to prove Jonathan wrong for the sake of personal satisfaction. His journey had always been about something much bigger than that. It had been about creating a space for artists like him, about showing the art world that talent wasn't confined to those with the right credentials, the right background, or the right connections. Darnell's story had become a testament to resilience, vision, and the transformative power of art. He realized that his success had never been just about him. It had been about paving the way for others, ensuring that future generations of artists would not have to struggle the way he did. His journey was proof that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve greatness if given the opportunity. It wasn't just his personal achievements that mattered, it was the opportunities he had created for others, the changes he had brought to the art world, and the future he was building for emerging voices. As Darnell stood among the artists whose work lined the walls of the gallery, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This space, this gallery, was more than just a business. It was a legacy. It was a place where the next generation of artists could express themselves freely, without fear of rejection or exclusion. It was a space where the power of art to challenge the world, to tell the truth, and to spark change would continue to thrive. Darnell's lasting impact. Darnell Foster's legacy extended far beyond his art. He had proven to the world that success in the art world wasn't reserved for the privileged few, it was for those who believed in their vision and were willing to fight for it. He had demonstrated that art wasn't just about selling paintings or creating aesthetically pleasing work, it was about pushing boundaries, telling difficult truths, and sparking important conversations. Darnell's gallery was more than just a space for exhibitions, it was a launchpad for the careers of countless young artists. His mentorship programs helped to lift up voices that had been ignored or marginalized, and his commitment to diversity and inclusion changed the very fabric of the art world. The artists who had once been excluded from the traditional art scene now had a place to flourish, and their work was reaching audiences who had never before been exposed to such powerful narratives. Through his art, his gallery, and his mentorship, Darnell inspired countless artists to break barriers and create their own paths. He showed them that the art world could be transformed when people challenged the status quo and refused to accept the limitations imposed on them. His story was a reminder that no matter where you came from, or what obstacles stood in your way, you had the power to change the world if you were brave enough to fight for it. Darnell's impact was not only felt in the art world. His story had become a beacon of hope for people in all fields who had been told they weren't good enough, who had been overlooked, or who had faced systemic barriers. Darnell's journey showed them that success wasn't about fitting into the mold, it was about breaking it. As the years went by, Darnell's legacy continued to inspire new generations of artists, curators, and collectors. His gallery remained a space for creative freedom, cultural dialogue, and innovation, and his impact on the art world would continue to reverberate for years to come. Darnell Foster had not just changed the art world, he had changed the way the world saw art itself. His story was proof that when people stand up for what they believe in, when they challenge the systems that seek to hold them back, they can create a legacy that transcends time and transforms the world for the better.